In the dim light of a flickering flame, shadows dance across ancient walls, their forms twisting and turning in the dark. Among them, a figure emerges, one that has haunted the dreams of humanity for centuries. She is neither fully human nor entirely spirit. She is the witch, a creature of power, mystery, and fear. Her presence is as old as time itself, and her story begins long before the word witch was ever spoken. Long ago, when the world was still young and the lines between the mortal and the divine were blurred, people believed in forces beyond their understanding. These forces, both benevolent and malevolent, were often personified as gods, spirits, and otherworldly beings. Among them were women who held the secrets of the earth and the sky. These women, with their knowledge of herbs, their ability to heal, and their connection to the unseen, were revered and feared in equal measure. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, stories were whispered about Lilith, a figure who defied the norms of her time. She was said to be the first wife of Adam, a woman who refused to be submissive, choosing instead to walk her own path. For this, she was cast out, becoming a symbol of rebellion and darkness. Lilith was blamed for the death of infants, and mothers would protect their children from her with amulets and prayers. Yet, beneath the fear, there was a twisted respect, a recognition of her power, her refusal to be tamed. As the centuries passed, this archetype evolved. In ancient Greece, Hecate emerged as the goddess of witchcraft, a guardian of the crossroads where the living and the dead meet. She was depicted with three faces, each one watching over the past, present, and future. Hecate was a guide for those who wandered in the dark, a beacon for lost souls. But she was also feared, for she could summon the dead and control the forces of the night. In her hands, she held the keys to the underworld, a place few dared to tread. But it wasn't just in the lands of the Greeks and Mesopotamians that these figures appeared. Across the ancient world, similar stories were told. In the cold, misty lands of the Celts, the Morrigan took shape. She was a goddess of war, often appearing as a crow on the battlefield, feeding on the bodies of the fallen. The Morrigan was not just a bringer of death, but a seer of fate, a harbinger of doom. Warriors would shiver at the sight of her, knowing that her presence meant their end was near. Yet, there was an undeniable allure to her power, a dark beauty in the chaos she brought. In the frozen north, the Norse spoke of the Volar, seeresses who could weave the threads of fate. These women were both revered and feared, for their prophecies could bring kings to their knees. The Volar were connected to the Norns, the weavers of destiny, and their words carried the weight of inevitability. A single prophecy from their lips could change the course of history. But with this power came isolation, as people feared what they could not control or understand. As these tales spread and evolved, the image of the witch began to take on a more sinister form. The early witches were not simply healers or wise women, they were seen as beings who could wield power over life and death. They could curse as well as cure, and this duality made them objects of fear. Their knowledge, once a source of healing, became a source of suspicion. The same herbs that could save a life could also take one. The same words that could bless could also curse. This ambiguity, this blurring of lines between good and evil, made the witch a figure to be both revered and feared. But it wasn't just their power that made witches feared, it was their independence. In a world where women were expected to be obedient and submissive, the witch was a figure who stood apart. She was often a woman who lived on the fringes of society, unmarried, childless, and free. This freedom, this refusal to conform, was a threat to the established order. The witch became a symbol of everything that was feared in a woman: her power, her independence, her sexuality. As civilizations grew and religions spread, these fears became codified in laws and doctrines. The early Christian church, seeking to establish its authority, began to condemn practices that were once part of the fabric of life. The old gods were demonized, and the women who served them were labeled as witches. The once revered healers and wise women were now seen as servants of the devil, their powers a threat to the new order. The witch, once a figure of power and wisdom, was now a scapegoat for all that was feared. In her, people saw the embodiment of the unknown, the unpredictable, the uncontrollable. She became a vessel for their darkest fears and their deepest desires. Her very existence was a challenge to the status quo, and for that, she was hunted, persecuted, and destroyed. Yet, despite the fear, there was always a fascination with the witch. She represented something primal, something that could not be fully understood or controlled. The witch was a reminder that, beneath the veneer of civilization, there were forces that could not be tamed. She was a symbol of the power that lies in the shadows, the power that can heal or destroy. In the end, the witch is not just a figure of fear, but a reflection of the human psyche. She is the embodiment of the darkness that exists in all of us, the part that we try to suppress but can never fully escape. The witch is a reminder that power, in any form, is both a blessing and a curse, and that those who wield it will always walk a fine line between reverence and fear. In the heart of the ancient world, where the rivers Tigris and Euphrates flowed, there was a land shrouded in mystery and magic. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, was a place where the lines between the living and the dead, the divine and the human, were as thin as a whisper. It was here that stories of witches and sorceresses were born, tales that have haunted humanity for thousands of years. Among these stories, one name rises like a dark shadow: Lilith. She is the woman who was said to be the first wife of Adam, but unlike Eve, Lilith was not content to be ruled. She was made from the same earth as Adam, and she knew her own power. When Adam tried to assert dominance, Lilith refused to submit. With a voice like thunder and eyes that could pierce the soul, she spoke the forbidden name of God and flew from the Garden of Eden, leaving behind a trail of fire and fury. Lilith's rebellion did not go unpunished. Cast out from paradise, she was condemned to roam the desolate wastelands, a creature of the night. The ancient Sumerians feared her as the cause of infant death, a demoness who stole newborns from their cradles. Mothers would tremble at the thought of her, clutching their babies close, knowing that the night belonged to Lilith. She became the embodiment of fear, a symbol of what happens when a woman dares to claim her own power. But Lilith was not the only figure of dark magic in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians and Babylonians believed in a world filled with spirits, both good and evil, and they knew that there were those who could command these spirits. Sorcerers and necromancers, men and women who could speak to the dead and bend the forces of nature to their will, walked among them. These practitioners of the dark arts were both revered and feared, for they held the keys to powers that could bring life or death. The ancient texts speak of rituals that could raise the dead, of spells that could bind a person's soul to the underworld. Necromancy, the practice of communicating with the dead, was a dangerous art, but it was one that promised power beyond imagination. In the darkness of night, under the light of a pale moon, the necromancer would draw symbols in the earth, calling forth the spirits of the departed. The air would grow cold, and a stillness would settle over the land as if the world itself was holding its breath. There were whispers of a book, the Maklu, a collection of incantations and rituals that could protect against evil or unleash it upon the world. This ancient text was said to contain the secrets of the universe, the knowledge of the gods themselves. But with such knowledge came great danger. Those who sought to use the Maklu for their own gain often paid the price, their souls consumed by the very forces they sought to control. In the city of Babylon, where the ziggurats rose like mountains to the sky, there lived those who claimed to hold the power of the gods. These sorcerers could summon storms, cast curses, and command the loyalty of demons. But their power came at a cost. To wield such magic, one had to give a part of oneself, a piece of the soul that could never be reclaimed. It was a sacrifice that few were willing to make, but those who did were feared and respected, for they had touched the darkness and lived to tell the tale. Among these sorcerers, there was one whose name was spoken only in hushed tones, Lamashtu. She was a goddess, but she was also a witch, a creature of pure malevolence. Lamashtu was said to devour the flesh of children and drink the blood of the living. Her presence was a curse, and those who crossed her path were doomed to a fate worse than death. To protect themselves, people would carve amulets, inscribing them with the name of Pazuzu, a demon who could drive Lamashtu away. But even with these protections, the fear of Lamashtu lingered in the hearts of the people, a reminder that the darkness was always close. In the shadows of Mesopotamia, the lines between magic and reality, between the living and the dead, were blurred. The witches and sorcerers of this ancient land were not mere figments of imagination, they were as real as the sun that rose over the plains. They walked the earth with power in their hands and darkness in their hearts, commanding the respect and fear of those around them. The tales of Lilith, Lamashtu, and the necromancers of Mesopotamia are not just stories of the past. They are echoes of a time when magic was a part of everyday life, when the unknown was something to be feared, and the night was a place of mystery and terror. These figures have left their mark on history, their stories passed down through generations, whispered in the dark, told around flickering fires. In Mesopotamia, the witch was more than just a symbol, she was a force of nature, a reminder that there are powers in this world that cannot be tamed. She was the embodiment of fear, but also of strength, of a power that came from knowing one's place in the world and refusing to be bound by it. The witches of ancient Mesopotamia were feared, but they were also revered, for they held the knowledge of the gods, the secrets of life and death. And in a world where the unknown was a constant companion, that knowledge was the most powerful force of all. Under the cold light of the moon, a figure stands at the crossroads, her shadow stretching long across the earth. She is neither mortal nor divine, but something in between, a force as old as the stars. This is Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, and the night is her domain. Her eyes are the darkness itself, and in her presence, the world holds its breath. Those who seek her favor come to these crossroads, trembling with both fear and anticipation, for Hecate is a goddess who demands respect, and her power is not to be taken lightly. In ancient Greece, Hecate was revered as the guardian of the unseen, the protector of those who walked the boundary between life and death. She was often depicted holding torches, lighting the way for souls lost in the shadows. But Hecate was more than just a guide, she was the keeper of secrets, the mistress of magic. Her followers, those who dared to invoke her name, were granted powers that defied the natural order. Yet, these gifts came at a price, for Hecate's power was as dangerous as it was potent, and those who wielded it walked a fine line between salvation and damnation. In the ancient tragedies of Greece, witches often played a central role, their presence marking the turning point between fate and doom. Among them, Circe stands out as one of the most haunting figures. On her island, far from the reach of men, Circe lived surrounded by wild beasts, each one under her spell. She was known for her beauty, but beneath that beauty lay a power that could break even the strongest of wills. When Odysseus and his men arrived on her shores, they were unsuspecting, unaware of the danger that awaited them. Circe welcomed them with open arms, offering them food and drink. But the wine they drank was laced with magic, and as they swallowed the sweet liquid, their forms began to twist and change. In an instant, they were no longer men but swine, trapped in their own animal bodies, their humanity stripped away by Circe's dark arts. Odysseus, with the help of the god Hermes, was able to resist Circe's spell and force her to release his men. But the memory of that island, where a woman's touch could turn a man into a beast, lingered long after they had sailed away. Circe was not just a witch, she was a warning, a reminder of the thin line between civilization and savagery, between the known and the unknown. And then there was Medea, a woman whose name has become synonymous with betrayal and vengeance. Medea was not born a witch, she was made one by the circumstances of her life. When Jason, the hero of the Argonauts, came to her homeland in search of the Golden Fleece, Medea fell in love with him. But this love was no ordinary love, it was a love born of desperation and fueled by magic. To help Jason, Medea used her knowledge of potions and spells, risking everything for the man she loved. But Jason, like so many men in Greek tragedies, was unfaithful. He betrayed Medea, leaving her for another woman, and in doing so, he unleashed a wrath that would consume them both. In her fury, Medea turned to the only thing she had left, her magic. She concocted a plan so dark, so filled with pain, that even the gods turned away. Medea sent a poisoned robe to Jason's new bride, a gift that burned her alive as soon as she put it on. But Medea's vengeance did not end there. In one final act of defiance, she killed her own children, the sons she had borne to Jason, ensuring that he would be left with nothing but the ashes of his dreams. Medea's story is one of love turned to hate, of power used not for healing but for destruction. She was a woman scorned, and in her pain, she became a force of nature, a storm that swept through the lives of those around her, leaving nothing but ruin in her wake. Yet, even as she committed these terrible acts, there was a part of Medea that was pitiable, a woman who had been driven to the brink by a world that had no place for her. Hecate, Circe, Medea, these are the witches of ancient Greece, women who stood apart from the rest of society, women who commanded powers that others could only dream of. But with that power came isolation, for to be a witch was to be alone, to live in the shadows, always on the fringes of the world. These women were feared, but they were also respected, for they held the keys to a world that few dared to enter. In the stories of ancient Greece, witches were not just figures of fear, they were symbols of the unknown, the embodiment of the mysteries that lay beyond the reach of ordinary men. They were women who refused to be confined by the roles that society had set for them, women who used their power to carve out their own place in the world. But in doing so, they paid a heavy price, for the power they wielded was as much a curse as it was a gift. The Hecatean mysteries, the spells of Circe, the vengeance of Medea, these are the tales that have been passed down through the ages, stories that still hold the power to chill the blood and stir the soul. They are reminders of a time when magic was real, when the world was filled with forces that could not be explained or controlled. And at the heart of these stories is the witch, a figure who stands at the crossroads, holding a torch that lights the way into the darkness. She is a guide, a guardian, a force to be reckoned with. And in the silence of the night, when the world is still and the shadows grow long, her presence can still be felt, a reminder that some powers can never be tamed. In the bustling streets of ancient Rome, where emperors ruled with iron fists and the Senate whispered secrets behind closed doors, there was a darker undercurrent that flowed beneath the surface. This was a city where power was everything, and those who sought it were willing to go to any lengths, even if it meant calling upon forces that were feared and shunned. In this world of political intrigue and ruthless ambition, the word witch could bring a man to his knees, and accusations of sorcery could turn the mightiest of rulers into trembling shadows of their former selves. Amidst this backdrop, one name echoed through the alleyways and grand halls alike: Canidia. She was no ordinary woman, for Canidia was feared as a witch, a master of dark arts who could command the forces of life and death with a mere flick of her hand. The Romans spoke her name in hushed tones, and mothers would warn their children to behave, lest Canidia come for them in the night. To those who crossed her path, she was a terror beyond comprehension, a woman who held sway over the unknown, whose eyes seemed to pierce through to the very soul. But who was Canidia, really? The poets of Rome painted her as a creature of horror, a figure who dabbled in the blackest of arts. Horace, one of Rome's most celebrated poets, described her as a ghastly figure, surrounded by the stench of decay, brewing potions from the bones of the dead. Her hair was wild, her eyes sunken with sleepless nights spent summoning spirits from the underworld. She was a woman who could twist the fates of men, turning love to hate, hope to despair. Canidia's powers were said to be so great that even the most powerful men in Rome trembled at the thought of invoking her wrath. Yet, Canidia was more than just a witch. She was a symbol of the fear that gripped Rome during a time of great uncertainty. The city was rife with paranoia, as political rivals and personal enemies sought to undermine each other by any means necessary. In this climate of suspicion, accusations of witchcraft became a weapon, a tool to eliminate those who stood in the way. And Canidia, with her fearsome reputation, became the embodiment of that weapon, the scapegoat upon whom all the anxieties of Rome could be heaped. The witch hunts in Rome were not like the frenzied mobs of later centuries, but they were no less brutal. The Romans, always keen on maintaining order, dealt with accused witches with a cold and calculated efficiency. Trials were held in secret, and the accused often had little chance to defend themselves. A mere whisper of association with witchcraft could lead to exile, imprisonment, or worse. And in a city where the balance of power was everything, it didn't take much for those whispers to turn into a deafening roar. Canidia herself became the focal point of many of these witchcraft scandals. She was accused of everything from casting spells to manipulating the minds of Rome's leaders. The tales of her deeds grew more terrifying with each retelling, as the people of Rome sought to make sense of the chaos around them. Some said she could raise the dead, others claimed she could curse entire families with a single glance. Whether or not these stories were true mattered little, for the mere belief in them was enough to seal her fate. One of the most chilling stories told of Canidia was that of her involvement in the death of a young boy. According to legend, Canidia had kidnapped the child, intending to use his blood in one of her dark rituals. The boy's screams were said to have echoed through the night, carried on the wind to the ears of those who dared to listen. When the authorities found the boy's lifeless body, drained of blood and life, there was little doubt in their minds that Canidia was responsible. Whether this tale was born of truth or fear, it solidified her reputation as one of the most feared witches in Rome. But Canidia was not alone in facing such accusations. Throughout the empire, men and women alike were accused of sorcery, their lives torn apart by the suspicion and fear that gripped the city. The witch hunts became a way for the powerful to rid themselves of rivals, a means of exerting control over a populace already teetering on the edge of panic. In a world where the gods themselves seemed fickle and capricious, the idea that a mere mortal could wield their power was both terrifying and tantalizing. And so, the stories of Canidia and others like her continued to grow, passed down through the generations as cautionary tales of the dangers of power and the fragility of life. In the end, it mattered little whether Canidia was truly a witch, or merely a victim of the times she lived in. What mattered was the fear she inspired, the way her name could silence a room and send shivers down the spine of even the bravest of men. In the shadows of Rome, where power was everything and trust was a luxury few could afford, the figure of the witch became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that there were forces in the world that could not be controlled or understood. And in Canidia, the Romans found the embodiment of that fear, a woman who stood as a testament to the darkness that lurked within every heart, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the mist-shrouded forests of ancient Celtic lands, there was a silence that spoke louder than any words. The trees seemed to breathe, the rivers whispered secrets, and the earth itself pulsed with a life that was both familiar and otherworldly. It was in these sacred groves and wild landscapes that the Morrigan, a goddess of war and fate, roamed. She was more than a mere figure in myth, she was the embodiment of death and destiny, a shape-shifting force that could appear as a raven on the battlefield or a beautiful maiden on the edge of a riverbank. Those who crossed her path knew that their fate was sealed, for the Morrigan's presence signaled that blood would be spilled and lives would be lost. But the Morrigan was not just a harbinger of death, she was also a protector of her people, a fierce guardian who would stop at nothing to defend the land she loved. She was feared, yes, but she was also revered, for to invoke her name was to call upon the ancient power of the earth itself. The Morrigan was a witch in the truest sense, a woman who wielded the power of life and death with equal measure, a figure who stood at the crossroads between the mortal and the divine. In the cold, windswept hills of Scotland, another figure loomed large in the minds of the people, the Cailleach. She was the ancient hag of winter, a goddess who ruled the dark half of the year. Her face was as craggy as the mountains she called home, her eyes as cold as the winter storms she brought with her. The Cailleach was not a witch in the conventional sense, she was older, more primal, a force of nature who could not be tamed or controlled. She was the embodiment of the wild, untamed landscape, a reminder that nature was not something to be conquered, but something to be respected, even feared. The Cailleach was both creator and destroyer. In one hand, she held the power to bring life, sculpting the mountains and carving the valleys. But in the other, she carried death, her breath freezing the land and her touch turning the earth to stone. Those who worshipped her did so with a mixture of reverence and dread, knowing that to anger the Cailleach was to bring about their own destruction. She was the Winter Witch, the Hag of the Highlands, a figure who reminded the Celts of the thin line between life and death. Far to the north, in the frozen lands of the Norse, there were women who walked a path not unlike that of the Morrigan and the Cailleach. These were the Volar, the seeresses who could peer into the threads of fate and unravel the mysteries of the future. The Volar were revered for their knowledge of the runes, the sacred symbols that held the secrets of the cosmos. They were sought out by kings and warriors alike, their counsel often determining the outcome of battles and the fates of entire kingdoms. The Volar were witches in the eyes of their people, women who could command the elements and communicate with the spirits of the dead. They were not just seers, they were also practitioners of seer, a form of Norse magic that involved trance and divination. The Volar would enter a trance-like state, allowing their spirits to travel to other realms, where they would seek out knowledge and power. But this power came at a cost, for the Volar walked a dangerous path, one that could lead to madness or death if they were not careful. One of the most famous Volar was the seeress who prophesied the doom of the gods at Ragnarok, the end of the world in Norse mythology. Her words were filled with a terrible certainty, a knowledge that the end was inevitable and that nothing could be done to stop it. The Volar's prophecy struck fear into the hearts of the gods themselves, for even they were powerless to change the fate she had seen. In this, the Volar were more than just witches, they were the voice of destiny, the living embodiment of the inexorable march of time. In both Celtic and Norse traditions, witches were not merely figures of fear or malevolence, they were respected as keepers of ancient wisdom, as intermediaries between the mortal world and the divine. The Morrigan, the Cailleach, and the Volar were all figures who commanded awe and reverence, their power rooted in the very fabric of the natural world. They were women who understood the cycles of life and death, who could call upon the forces of nature to do their bidding, and who walked the fine line between the seen and the unseen. But this power also set them apart, for to be a witch in these ancient cultures was to be both feared and revered, to stand on the edge of society, never fully belonging to the world of men. The witches of Celtic and Norse traditions were solitary figures, often living on the fringes of society, their presence both a blessing and a curse. They were consulted in times of need, but they were also shunned in times of peace, their power too great to be trusted by those who did not understand it. Yet, despite this isolation, these witches were never truly alone, for they were connected to the land itself, to the forces of nature that shaped the world around them. The Morrigan, with her ravens and her omens, was one with the battlefield, a constant presence in the lives of the warriors who fought and died in her name. The Cailleach, with her storms and her mountains, was the very essence of winter, a force that could not be denied. And the Volar, with their runes and their prophecies, were the voice of the gods, a reminder that even the mightiest of beings were subject to the whims of fate. In the end, the witches of Celtic and Norse traditions were more than just figures of myth and legend, they were symbols of the power that lies hidden within the natural world. A power that is both beautiful and terrifying, a power that can create and destroy with equal ease. And in their stories, there is a lesson that still resonates today, a reminder that the world is full of forces beyond our understanding, and that those who seek to control them must do so with great care, for the price of power is often far greater than we can ever imagine. In the stillness of a cold, unforgiving night, a woman stands alone, trembling under the weight of fear and desperation. The villagers' voices echo in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Her heart races, not just with the terror of what's to come, but with the bitter sting of betrayal. She had once been a healer, a midwife, someone who brought life into the world. Now, the same hands that once held newborns are bound tightly with ropes, and the same people who sought her help now call her a witch. The transition from myth to persecution was swift and brutal. In the Dark Ages, a time when the world seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos, the fear of the unknown gripped society with an iron fist. The old stories, once told by the warmth of the hearth, began to take on a darker tone. Witches were no longer revered as wise women or feared as powerful beings of nature, they became scapegoats for every ill that plagued the land. Crops failed, livestock died, children fell ill, and in the shadow of these misfortunes, the whisper of witchcraft spread like wildfire. The Church, in its quest to consolidate power, found in this fear a useful tool. The ancient tales of witches and sorcery were twisted, reshaped to fit a new narrative, one in which these women were no longer connected to the divine or the natural world, but to the devil himself. The witch became the embodiment of sin, a vessel of evil that threatened the very fabric of Christian society. Her power was no longer a gift, it was a curse, one that had to be rooted out and destroyed. The early witch hunts were marked by a sense of hysteria that defied reason. Accusations could be sparked by the smallest of things, a suspicious glance, a misunderstood word, a sudden illness. And once the accusation was made, there was little hope of escape. The methods used to extract confessions were as cruel as they were inhumane. Women were subjected to tortures that left them broken in body and spirit, forced to confess to crimes they had never committed. Their words, twisted under the pain of the rack or the weight of water, became evidence against them, sealing their fate. In the eyes of the church, these confessions were proof of the devil's work in the world. The more women who were accused and condemned, the more it seemed that witchcraft was a widespread and imminent threat. The fear fed itself, growing larger and more monstrous with each passing year. The witch trials became spectacles, public displays of righteous fury where the faithful could witness the destruction of evil. The pyres that burned across Europe were not just meant to kill, they were meant to purify, to cleanse the world of a darkness that was seen as corrupting the very soul of humanity. But for the women who stood accused, there was no purification, no redemption. There was only pain, humiliation, and death. These were not witches in the sense of the old stories. They were often women who had little power or influence, those who lived on the margins of society, those who were different. Widows, healers, midwives, and the elderly became the prime targets, their knowledge of herbs and medicine seen as proof of their pact with the devil. Their isolation made them easy to accuse, easy to condemn, and easy to forget. The church's role in shaping the witch archetype cannot be understated. It was during the Dark Ages that the image of the witch as an evil, malevolent force became solidified in the collective consciousness. The church's teaching spread far and wide, preaching that witches were the servants of Satan, that they consorted with demons and practiced dark magic in secret covens. The fear of witchcraft became intertwined with the fear of heresy, and those who were accused were often tried and condemned as both witches and heretics. This period marked the beginning of a long, dark chapter in human history, one in which fear and superstition overruled reason and compassion. The witch hunts of the Dark Ages set the stage for the even more brutal persecutions that would follow in later centuries as the fear of witches continued to grow and fester. The flames that consumed the so-called witches of this era did not just destroy their bodies, they burned away the old understanding of witches as figures of power and mystery, replacing it with an image of pure, unrelenting evil. As the woman stands before the jeering crowd, the flames licking at her feet, she is no longer just a healer or a midwife. In the eyes of those who have condemned her, she is a witch, a servant of the devil, and her death is seen as a victory for the forces of good. But in her final moments, as the smoke fills her lungs and the heat sears her skin, she is still the woman she has always been, someone who loved, who cared, who tried to make the world a better place in whatever small way she could. The cries of the crowd grow louder, their faces contorted with fear and hatred, and as the flames rise higher, the woman's thoughts turn to the earth, to the trees and the rivers that once brought her solace. She closes her eyes, and in that final, agonizing moment, she reaches out for the comfort of the old ways, for the connection to the natural world that has always been her strength. But that world is now lost to her, consumed by the flames of ignorance and fear, and as the darkness takes her, she becomes just another name on a long list of those who were sacrificed to a fear that could not be understood, only destroyed. The winds howled through the narrow streets of Kilkenny, carrying whispers of fear and suspicion. In the darkened corners of medieval Europe, a storm was brewing, a storm of fear, superstition, and blood. At the heart of this tempest stood a woman, her name etched into history not by her own hand, but by the hands of those who feared her, Alice Cuyler. Alice was no ordinary woman. Born into wealth, she was a woman of influence and means in a time when such things were rare for those of her gender. But in the eyes of the townspeople, her success was not a product of intelligence or hard work, it was something darker, something sinister. Her husbands died one by one, each leaving her richer than before. Whispers began to spread, whispers that she had bewitched them, that she had used sorcery to rob them of their lives and fortunes. The people of Kilkenny began to look at her not as a widow, but as a witch. The accusations were only the beginning. As the fear spread, so did the tales of her alleged deeds. Alice was said to have sacrificed animals in the dead of night, to have brewed potions with ingredients too ghastly to mention. She was accused of worshipping a demon, a dark figure who helped her achieve her wealth and power. The once respected woman was now the target of a growing hysteria, a hysteria that would consume not just her, but many others like her. Her trial was a spectacle, a grim theater of fear and prejudice. The evidence against her was nothing more than the wild imaginings of a frightened populace, yet it was enough to seal her fate. Her servants were tortured until they confessed to crimes they had never committed. Alice herself fled, her wealth and influence buying her temporary safety, but the damage was done. The fear that had gripped Kilkenny spread like a plague, infecting the minds of people across Europe. The case of Alice Cuyler was not an isolated incident. It was a spark in a tinderbox, one that would ignite a wildfire of persecution across the continent. The 14th century was a time of upheaval, of famine, plague, and war. The world seemed to be unraveling, and in the midst of this chaos, people looked for someone to blame. Witches became the scapegoats for all that was wrong in the world. They were blamed for failed crops, for the spread of disease, for the suffering that seemed to have no end. The witch hunts that followed were a manifestation of this collective fear. Across Europe, women, and sometimes men, were accused, tortured, and executed for crimes they could not have committed. The hysteria spread from town to town, fueled by superstition and ignorance. The trials were often nothing more than show trials, where the outcome was predetermined, and the accused had no chance of proving their innocence. The methods used to extract confessions were as brutal as they were effective. The accused were subjected to the most inhumane tortures, burned, stretched, crushed, until they would confess to anything just to make the pain stop. Their confessions were then used as proof of their guilt, and they were executed in the most public and humiliating ways possible. Burning at the stake was the most common method, a horrifying spectacle meant to serve as a warning to others. But even death did not bring an end to the persecution. The witch hunts were a self-perpetuating cycle. The more people who were accused and executed, the more others were suspected of witchcraft. The fear fed on itself, growing larger and more all-consuming with each passing day. The mass hysteria of the 14th century was not just a dark chapter in European history, it was a nightmare that haunted the lives of countless people, a nightmare from which there was no waking. For those who lived through this time, the fear was all-encompassing. No one was safe from suspicion, not even the most pious or respected members of society. The witch hunts tore communities apart, pitting neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. The bonds of trust that had held these communities together were shattered, replaced by an all-consuming paranoia. In some cases, entire villages were wiped out, their populations decimated by the witch hunts. The rise of witch hunts in medieval Europe was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. It was a time when reason was abandoned and fear ruled the day. The people who were accused and executed during this time were not witches, they were victims of a society that had lost its way, a society that had allowed fear and superstition to override compassion and justice. Their stories are a grim reminder of what can happen when fear is allowed to run unchecked, when the voices of reason and humanity are silenced. Alice Cuyler's story is just one of many, but it is a story that resonates through the ages. It is a story of fear, of injustice, of a woman who was persecuted not for what she had done, but for what others feared she could do. Her name has become synonymous with the witch hunts of medieval Europe, a symbol of the dark side of human nature, a side that still lurks in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The witch hunts may be a thing of the past, but the fear that fueled them is not. It is a fear that still exists today, a fear of the unknown, of those who are different, of the things we do not understand. It is a fear that can drive people to do unspeakable things, to commit acts of cruelty and violence in the name of righteousness. The story of Alice Cuyler and the witches of medieval Europe is a story that must not be forgotten, a story that must be remembered as a warning of what can happen when fear is allowed to rule. In the cold, dimly lit chambers of the Inquisition, a book was born, a book that would cast a shadow so dark it would stretch across centuries. This was not a book of knowledge or enlightenment, but one of fear, hatred, and death. Its name alone sent shivers down the spines of those who knew its contents, Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. The year was 1487, and Europe was already a continent steeped in paranoia and superstition. Plagues had ravaged the land, wars had torn communities apart, and the church was struggling to maintain its iron grip on the hearts and minds of the people. In this climate of fear, the Malleus Maleficarum was not just a book, it was a weapon. A weapon forged by two men, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, who saw themselves as crusaders in a holy war against the forces of darkness. But the darkness they fought was not a tangible enemy, it was an idea, a fear that had been festering in the minds of men and women for centuries, the fear of witchcraft. The book was more than just a manual, it was a manifesto of terror. It laid out, in painstaking detail, how to identify, interrogate, and execute those accused of witchcraft. It was a guidebook for inquisitors, a roadmap to destruction, and its influence was immediate and devastating. In the pages of the Malleus Maleficarum, the authors painted a terrifying picture of witches as agents of the devil, beings who consorted with demons, who caused disease, infertility, and death. These witches were said to be everywhere, hiding in plain sight, lurking in the shadows of every village, waiting to strike. The fear that this book instilled in people was palpable, a fear that spread like wildfire through towns and cities, turning neighbors against each other, turning the innocent into the accused. The Malleus Maleficarum gave a veneer of legitimacy to the witch hunts that followed. It provided the so-called proof that witchcraft was real, that it was a threat, and that it needed to be eradicated at all costs. The methods of interrogation it recommended were brutal and inhumane. Torture was not just condoned, it was encouraged. The logic was twisted. If a woman screamed and confessed under torture, it was proof of her guilt. If she did not, it was proof that the devil had given her the strength to resist, and she was guilty nonetheless. The victims of the Malleus Maleficarum were often women, midwives, healers, widows, those who lived on the margins of society. They were the vulnerable, the different, the ones who did not fit into the rigid mold of what a good woman should be. The book turned these women into monsters in the eyes of the public, creatures to be feared, hunted, and destroyed. Thousands of innocent people were accused, tortured, and executed as a direct result of this book. The fear it created was so intense that even the slightest suspicion, a whispered rumor, or a minor misfortune could lead to an accusation of witchcraft. As the witch hunt spread across Europe, the Malleus Maleficarum became the Inquisitor's Bible. Its influence reached far beyond the borders of Germany, where it was first published. In France, Italy, Spain, England, wherever the church's influence was strong, the book found its way into the hands of those who sought to root out witchcraft. The terror it unleashed was almost unimaginable. Women, and sometimes men, were dragged from their homes in the dead of night, subjected to horrors that no human being should ever have to endure. They were stripped of their dignity, their humanity, and finally, their lives. The Malleus Maleficarum did more than just fuel the witch hunts, it changed the very nature of them. Before its publication, accusations of witchcraft were often dismissed as superstitions, but the book gave these accusations the weight of law. It transformed the witch hunts from sporadic, isolated events into systematic, state-sponsored campaigns of terror. The Malleus Maleficarum was not just a book, it was a weapon of mass destruction, one that left a trail of blood and suffering in its wake. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Malleus Maleficarum was not its content, but its impact on the human soul. It turned ordinary men into monsters, giving them the authority to commit unspeakable acts in the name of righteousness. It gave them the power to destroy lives with a word, to torture and kill with impunity. It gave them the power to play God. The victims of the Malleus Maleficarum were not just killed, they were erased from history, their names forgotten, their lives reduced to a footnote in the annals of human cruelty. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, wives, ordinary people who lived in extraordinary times. They were the victims of a society that had lost its way, a society that had allowed fear and superstition to override reason and compassion. The Malleus Maleficarum was more than just a book, it was a nightmare, one that haunted Europe for centuries. Its legacy is a dark one, a legacy of fear, hatred, and death. It is a reminder of the power of words, and the destruction that can be wrought when those words are used to incite fear and hatred. The Malleus Maleficarum may have been written over 500 years ago, but its echoes can still be heard today, in the dark corners of the human mind where fear and hatred still dwell. It is a chapter in human history that we must never forget, a chapter that serves as a warning of what can happen when fear is allowed to rule. The year was 1692, and the small, isolated village of Salem in Massachusetts was gripped by a terror that would leave a scar on history forever. It began like a whisper, a ripple in the fabric of a tightly wound society. The cold, biting winds of winter seemed to carry with them an air of something sinister, something that lurked just beyond the reach of reason. Fear had taken root, and in the shadowy corners of Salem, it began to grow, twisting and turning until it consumed the entire community. It all started with two young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, who began to exhibit strange and alarming behaviors, fits, contortions, and wild, incoherent babbling. The village doctor, unable to find a physical cause, made a chilling diagnosis: the girls were under the influence of witchcraft. The word itself was like a spark in dry tinder. Accusations began to fly, and soon the fear that had quietly simmered beneath the surface erupted into a full-blown inferno of paranoia. Names were whispered, fingers were pointed, and soon the accusations spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for the entire village to be engulfed in a wave of hysteria. Once a name was spoken, it seemed to take on a life of its own, and the accused found themselves caught in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The people of Salem, once neighbors and friends, turned on each other with a fervor that can only be born of fear. Among the first to be accused was Tituba, a slave in the household of Reverend Samuel Paris. Under the pressure of relentless questioning and fear of her own life, Tituba confessed to practicing witchcraft, claiming that she had been led by the devil himself. Her confession was like a dam breaking, and the flood of accusations that followed swept through Salem with devastating force. As more people were accused, the once small and insular community became a battleground, where old grudges and petty jealousies were settled with deadly consequences. The trials that followed were nothing short of a travesty. The accused were subjected to brutal interrogations, where the mere act of denying the charges was seen as further proof of their guilt. Evidence was flimsy at best. Spectral evidence, dreams, and visions were considered enough to condemn a person to death. The fear was so pervasive that even the most outlandish accusations were believed without question. And the more the accused tried to defend themselves, the more they were seen as being in league with the devil. One by one, the accused were brought before the court, where they faced a jury that had already decided their fate. Their pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears, and the verdict was almost always the same: guilty. And with that verdict came the sentence of death, usually by hanging. The noose became a symbol of the madness that had taken hold of Salem, and as the bodies of the condemned swung lifelessly from the gallows, the true horror of what was happening began to sink in. The Salem witch trials were not just a legal proceeding, they were a manifestation of a society that had been driven to the brink by fear. The community was caught in a web of its own making, where the boundaries between truth and lies, reality and illusion, had become hopelessly blurred. It was a time when logic and reason were abandoned, and in their place, superstition and paranoia ruled. The social fabric of Salem was torn apart by the trials. Friends turned against friends, families were ripped apart, and the once close-knit community became a place of suspicion and distrust. The fear that had been sown so long ago had finally come to harvest, and it was a bitter crop indeed. The trials took on a life of their own, feeding off the fear and paranoia of the people, until it seemed there would be no end to the madness. The victims of the Malleus Maleficarum were often women, midwives, healers, widows, those who lived on the margins of society. They were the vulnerable, the different, the ones who did not fit into the rigid mold of what a good woman should be. The book turned these women into monsters in the eyes of the public, creatures to be feared, hunted, and destroyed. Thousands of innocent people were accused, tortured, and executed as a direct result of this book. The fear it created was so intense that even the slightest suspicion, a whispered rumor, or a minor misfortune could lead to an accusation of witchcraft. As the witch hunt spread across Europe, the Malleus Maleficarum became the Inquisitor's Bible. Its influence reached far beyond the borders of Germany, where it was first published. In France, Italy, Spain, England, wherever the church's influence was strong, the book found its way into the hands of those who sought to root out witchcraft. The terror it unleashed was almost unimaginable. Women, and sometimes men, were dragged from their homes in the dead of night, subjected to horrors that no human being should ever have to endure. They were stripped of their dignity, their humanity, and finally, their lives. The Malleus Maleficarum did more than just fuel the witch hunts, it changed the very nature of them. Before its publication, accusations of witchcraft were often dismissed as superstitions, but the book gave these accusations the weight of law. It transformed the witch hunts from sporadic, isolated events into systematic, state-sponsored campaigns of terror. The Malleus Maleficarum was not just a book, it was a weapon of mass destruction, one that left a trail of blood and suffering in its wake. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Malleus Maleficarum was not its content, but its impact on the human soul. It turned ordinary men into monsters, giving them the authority to commit unspeakable acts in the name of righteousness. It gave them the power to destroy lives with a word, to torture and kill with impunity. It gave them the power to play God. The victims of the Malleus Maleficarum were not just killed, they were erased from history, their names forgotten, their lives reduced to a footnote in the annals of human cruelty. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, wives, ordinary people who lived in extraordinary times. They were the victims of a society that had lost its way, a society that had allowed fear and superstition to override reason and compassion. The Malleus Maleficarum was more than just a book, it was a nightmare, one that haunted Europe for centuries. Its legacy is a dark one, a legacy of fear, hatred, and death. It is a reminder of the power of words, and the destruction that can be wrought when those words are used to incite fear and hatred. The Malleus Maleficarum may have been written over 500 years ago, but its echoes can still be heard today, in the dark corners of the human mind where fear and hatred still dwell. It is a chapter in human history that we must never forget, a chapter that serves as a warning of what can happen when fear is allowed to rule. The year was 1692, and the small, isolated village of Salem in Massachusetts was gripped by a terror that would leave a scar on history forever. It began like a whisper, a ripple in the fabric of a tightly wound society. The cold, biting winds of winter seemed to carry with them an air of something sinister, something that lurked just beyond the reach of reason. Fear had taken root, and in the shadowy corners of Salem, it began to grow, twisting and turning until it consumed the entire community. It all started with two young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, who began to exhibit strange and alarming behaviors, fits, contortions, and wild, incoherent babbling. The village doctor, unable to find a physical cause, made a chilling diagnosis: the girls were under the influence of witchcraft. The word itself was like a spark in dry tinder. Accusations began to fly, and soon the fears that had quietly simmered beneath the surface erupted into a full-blown inferno of paranoia. Names were whispered, fingers were pointed, and soon the accusations spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for the entire village to be engulfed in a wave of hysteria. Once a name was spoken, it seemed to take on a life of its own, and the accused found themselves caught in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The people of Salem, once neighbors and friends, turned on each other with a fervor that can only be born of fear. Among the first to be accused was Tituba, a slave in the household of Reverend Samuel Paris. Under the pressure of relentless questioning and fear of her own life, Tituba confessed to practicing witchcraft, claiming that she had been led by the devil himself. Her confession was like a dam breaking, and the flood of accusations that followed swept through Salem with devastating force. As more people were accused, the once small and insular community became a battleground, where old grudges and petty jealousies were settled with deadly consequences. The trials that followed were nothing short of a travesty. The accused were subjected to brutal interrogations, where the mere act of denying the charges was seen as further proof of their guilt. Evidence was flimsy at best. Spectral evidence, dreams, and visions were considered enough to condemn a person to death. The fear was so pervasive that even the most outlandish accusations were believed without question. And the more the accused tried to defend themselves, the more they were seen as being in league with the devil. One by one, the accused were brought before the court, where they faced a jury that had already decided their fate. Their pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears, and the verdict was almost always the same: guilty. And with that verdict came the sentence of death, usually by hanging. The noose became a symbol of the madness that had taken hold of Salem, and as the bodies of the condemned swung lifelessly from the gallows, the true horror of what was happening began to sink in. The Salem witch trials were not just a legal proceeding, they were a manifestation of a society that had been driven to the brink by fear. The community was caught in a web of its own making, where the boundaries between truth and lies, reality and illusion, had become hopelessly blurred. It was a time when logic and reason were abandoned, and in their place, superstition and paranoia ruled. The social fabric of Salem was torn apart by the trials. Friends turned against friends, families were ripped apart, and the once close-knit community became a place of suspicion and distrust. The fear that had been sown so long ago had finally come to harvest, and it was a bitter crop indeed. The trials took on a life of their own, feeding off the fear and paranoia of the people, until it seemed there would be no end to the madness. But as the trials continued, a growing sense of unease began to take hold. Some began to question the legitimacy of the accusations, the fairness of the trials, and the righteousness of the executions. It was becoming clear that the true witchcraft in Salem was not practiced by those who stood accused, but by the fear and hysteria that had gripped the entire village. The turning point came when Governor William Phips intervened, influenced by increasing public outcry and the realization that the trials had spiraled out of control. The court of Weir and Terminer was dissolved, and the remaining accused were eventually pardoned. But for the 20 people who had already been executed, it was too late. Their lives had been taken by a community that had allowed fear to cloud its judgment, and their deaths would forever stain the history of Salem. The Salem witch trials remain one of the most infamous episodes in American history, a tragic example of what can happen when fear is allowed to overpower reason. The village of Salem was left to pick up the pieces of its shattered community, haunted by the memories of those who had been lost to the madness. The echoes of those dark days can still be heard, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked paranoia and the terrible cost of fear. On a chilly winter's day in 1612, the quiet, misty moors of Pendle Hill in England became the stage for a drama of dark and devastating proportions. The villagers of Pendle, nestled in the Lancashire countryside, would soon find themselves embroiled in one of the most infamous witch trials in English history. The air was thick with suspicion and dread, and the wind seemed to whisper of the horrors that were about to unfold. It all began with a series of ominous events. In the small, close-knit community, a series of unexplained misfortunes, sudden deaths, illness, and crop failures began to plague the area. As often happened in such times of turmoil, the blame fell on those who were different, those who were already viewed with suspicion. In Pendle, these were the elderly and the poor, people who lived on the fringes of society. The story centers on 12 individuals from two families, the Demdikes and the Chaddixes. They were poor, marginalized, and lived in a world where superstition held as much power as law. The Demdike family, led by the elderly and bedridden Elizabeth Southerns, known as Old Demdike, were seen as the epitome of witchcraft. Her daughter, Alison Device, had been accused of witchcraft, and it wasn't long before the allegations spread to encompass her entire family. The Chaddix family, including the elderly and Whittle and her daughter, also found themselves in the crosshairs of suspicion. The Pendle witches were accused of using their supposed powers to inflict harm on their neighbors. Tales of curses, maleficium, evil magic, and sinister rituals filled the air. Alison Device, who had already been accused of witchcraft, was said to have been seen with a mysterious peddler who was later found dead under suspicious circumstances. This link, whether real or imagined, became a crucial piece of the prosecution's case. The trials began in August 1612, and the atmosphere was one of intense fear and expectation. The accused were put on display, paraded before a public eager for retribution. The court proceedings were a farce of justice, confessions were coerced, often under the threat of torture or death. The pendulum of the trials swung decisively against the accused. Many confessed to practices they had never committed, often to avoid the more brutal fate that awaited them. The conditions under which the accused were held were brutal. Incarceration was a sentence of physical and mental torment. The trial itself was a spectacle, a grim theater where the accused were not given the benefit of a fair defense. In this climate of fear and hysteria, the lines between reality and accusation blurred, and the outcome seemed all but assured. The trials concluded with a harrowing result. 10 people were found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to death. The executions were swift, with the majority being hanged in the local town of Lancaster. The grim spectacle of their deaths served as a public lesson in the perils of witchcraft, reinforcing the fear and hatred that had fueled the trials. The impact of the Pendle witch trials rippled through English society. They were not just a tragic event for those directly involved, but a reflection of the wider anxieties and prejudices of the time. The trials intensified the already growing fear of witchcraft in England and marked a dark chapter in the history of witch hunts. The Pendle witches became symbols of the broader witch craze that swept through Europe, a reminder of the power of fear to turn communities against themselves. The Pendle witches' story also highlighted the brutal and often arbitrary nature of such trials. The accused, many of whom were innocent, were caught in a web of accusations and suspicions that led to their untimely deaths. The trials became a chilling example of how fear can transform ordinary people into monsters and lead to the senseless destruction of lives. In the centuries since, the Pendle witch trials have been remembered as a dark episode in English history, a stark reminder of the dangers of superstition and the consequences of societal hysteria. The names of those who suffered have not been forgotten, and their story serves as a poignant reflection on the price of fear and the enduring impact of injustice. The hills of Pendle, now quiet and serene, hold the echoes of a time when fear and suspicion tore through the heart of a community, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and a somber reminder of the human cost of witch hunts. The year was 1626, and the air was thick with an almost palpable dread in the cities of Würzburg and Bamberg in Germany. These were not ordinary times. They were marked by a relentless wave of fear and suspicion that would claim hundreds of lives in a brutal witch hunt. The towns, once vibrant and bustling with life, became darkened by the shadow of a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The witch hunts in Würzburg and Bamberg stand out as some of the most horrifying chapters in the history of European witch trials. In these cities, the paranoia of witchcraft was not just a rumor but an all-consuming frenzy that turned neighbor against neighbor and tore families apart. In Würzburg, the situation began to spiral out of control under the influence of Prince Bishop Johann Gottfried von Eschhausen and his successor, Prince Bishop Julius Ector von Mespelbrunn. Both men were staunchly devoted to eradicating what they saw as the evil of witchcraft. Their determination to root out witches led to a series of trials that were nothing short of a bloodbath. People from all walks of life, including men, women, and even children, were accused of witchcraft. The process of accusation and trial was horrifying. The methods used to extract confessions were cruel beyond belief. Torture became a routine part of the trials. The accused were subjected to brutal and inhumane practices designed to force them into admitting guilt. The most infamous of these methods included the strappado, where the victim's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted into the air, causing excruciating pain in their shoulders and limbs. The burning of the flesh and the snapping of bones were not unusual sights during these ordeals. Under such relentless torture, many confessed to crimes they had never committed, naming others in the hope of escaping their own suffering. The city of Bamberg was no different. Here, the witch hunts were spearheaded by powerful figures like Prince Bishop Johann George II. The trials in Bamberg were infamous for their scale and brutality. Over 600 people were executed, including a number of children who were caught in the web of accusations. The very young were not spared from the relentless fury of the hunts. Children, some as young as 7, were accused of witchcraft, subjected to horrifying torture, and executed. The reasons behind these accusations were often as trivial as a neighbor's displeasure or a sudden misfortune in the community. The impact on the victims and their families was devastating. The torture left physical and emotional scars that never healed. Families were torn apart, with accusations and trials creating an atmosphere of mistrust and fear. Entire communities were shattered as people who had lived together peacefully for years turned on one another, driven by the terror of being accused themselves. The personal toll was immense, lives were lost, families destroyed, and the societal fabric of these cities was irreparably damaged. The executions were conducted with a grim efficiency. The most common method was burning at the stake, where the accused were tied to a post and set ablaze. The fires that consumed the bodies of the so-called witches were meant to purify the land of evil, but instead served as a macabre display of the hysteria that had taken over. The crackling of the flames and the screams of the condemned were chilling reminders of the cruelty that had gripped Würzburg and Bamberg. As the witch hunts continued, the senselessness of the trials became increasingly apparent. The sheer number of victims and the brutality of their treatment began to provoke doubt and criticism. Voices of dissent grew louder, questioning the legitimacy of the trials and the morality of the methods used. The witch hunts eventually began to wind down as skepticism and outrage spread, but by then, the damage had been done. The cities of Würzburg and Bamberg were left to mourn the loss of hundreds of innocent lives, and the scars of the witch hunts remained a dark chapter in their history. The events in Würzburg and Bamberg were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of witch hunts that swept across Europe. The trials in these cities serve as a haunting reminder of the destructive power of fear and superstition. They tell a story of human suffering and cruelty on a scale that is almost beyond comprehension. The echoes of those dark days still resonate, a chilling testament to the capacity for evil that can arise when fear overcomes reason. In the quiet Swedish village of Torsåker, the winter of 1675 brought with it a chilling wave of hysteria that would forever haunt the history of witchcraft trials. The bitter cold and the dark, unyielding nights seemed to mirror the fear that gripped the small community, where whispers of witchcraft turned into a storm of accusations and executions. It all began with a series of unfortunate events that set the village on edge. A plague of illness, coupled with crop failures, left the people of Torsåker feeling desperate and vulnerable. In these desperate times, when nothing seemed to go right, the villagers looked for someone to blame. They found their scapegoats in the form of alleged witches. The trials that ensued were nothing short of a nightmare. The accusations came quickly and were often based on flimsy or entirely false evidence. Neighbors turned against one another, fueled by fear and superstition. The whispers of maleficium, evil magic, grew louder, echoing through the icy streets and into the homes of the accused. In Torsåker, the witch trials were marked by their sheer scale. Over 70 people were accused, and the trial quickly became a frenzy of fear and accusation. The victims were mostly women, but men and even children were not spared from the growing wave of paranoia. The age of the accused varied, but the youngest were as young as 12, caught in the net of accusations that had no mercy. The torture methods used to extract confessions were brutal and inhumane. The accused were subjected to unimaginable pain in hopes of forcing them to admit to crimes they did not commit. Waterboarding, a technique where the accused was strapped down and water poured over their face, was common. This method simulated drowning, inflicting intense suffering. The psychological torment was equally harsh, as people were threatened with death and torture until they gave false confessions. The societal conditions of the time played a significant role in the escalation of the trials. Sweden, like many parts of Europe, was experiencing a period of economic hardship and social instability. The country was grappling with the aftereffects of war, and the people were struggling to make ends meet. In this environment of uncertainty and fear, the idea of witchcraft became a convenient explanation for the misfortunes that befell the community. The Church, with its strict doctrines and intolerance for dissent, also played a role in stoking the fires of fear. It preached that witchcraft was a real and present danger, and its leaders encouraged the trials as a means of purging the community of evil. The impact of the Torsåker witch trials was devastating. The executions were carried out with grim efficiency, and the sight of so many innocent lives lost left a deep scar on the community. The once vibrant village was left to grapple with the aftermath of its actions. Families were torn apart, and the once thriving community was forever changed by the tragedy. The horror of the Torsåker trials did not go unnoticed outside the village. News of the mass executions spread, and the trials became a stark example of the destructive power of hysteria and superstition. The events in Torsåker were a dark chapter in Sweden's history, a reminder of the depths to which fear can drive people and the devastating consequences of allowing such fears to run unchecked. In the years following the trials, the events of Torsåker became a somber memory. The village, once engulfed in fear and bloodshed, slowly began to heal. The stories of those who suffered during the trials became part of the local lore, a haunting reminder of a time when fear and ignorance led to the loss of many innocent lives. The legacy of the Torsåker witch trials serves as a powerful testament to the horrors that can arise when a community succumbs to mass hysteria, and the lessons learned from this dark period continue to resonate through history. In the misty and rugged landscape of 16th century Scotland, a chilling tale of paranoia and persecution unfolded that would leave a dark stain on the nation's history. The North Berwick witch trials, ignited by a storm of fear and superstition, became one of the most infamous witch hunts in Scottish history. At the heart of this frenzy was a sense of dread that reached its peak when King James VI became embroiled in the trials. The North Berwick witch trials began in 1590, when a violent storm ravaged the Scottish coast. The storm was so fierce that it was believed to have been caused by witchcraft. The people of Scotland, already on edge and rife with superstitions, became convinced that malevolent witches were to blame for the tempest. The storm became the catalyst for accusations, leading to a series of trials that would ensnare many innocent lives. King James VI, who would later become James I of England, was deeply influenced by the trials. His belief in the existence of witches was unwavering, and his experience with the North Berwick trials only solidified his fears. James was not a passive observer, he actively participated in the witch hunts, driven by his intense belief in the threat of witchcraft. His involvement made the trials a matter of personal and political significance. James's fascination with witchcraft was not merely a matter of personal belief. In 1597, he authored a book titled Demonology, which outlined his views on witchcraft and demonology. This book was a crucial influence on the witch hunts, as it provided a framework for understanding and prosecuting witches. In Demonology, James described witches as malevolent beings who conspired with the devil to bring about chaos and destruction. His writings fueled the fear and suspicion that drove the North Berwick trials. The trials themselves were marked by a series of horrific events. Among the accused was a woman named Agnes Sampson, who was one of the first to be arrested. She, along with others, was subjected to brutal torture in an attempt to extract confessions. The methods used were as savage as they were inhumane. Victims were subjected to the witch's bridle, a device designed to cause immense pain and prevent speech. The torture was meant to force the accused to admit to their alleged crimes and to implicate others. Many confessions were given under duress, leading to even more accusations and an ever-expanding list of supposed witches. The trials reached their most harrowing moment with the execution of the accused. The accused were often burned at the stake, their screams a horrific soundtrack to the madness that had gripped Scotland. The public executions were meant to serve as a deterrent, a grim spectacle designed to instill fear and ensure compliance with the king's views on witchcraft. The sight of the burning pyres and the cries of the condemned became a grim reminder of the paranoia that had overtaken the nation. The impact of the North Berwick witch trials and the influence of King James VI was profound. The trials were not just a local phenomenon, but part of a broader European witch craze that saw countless lives lost to hysteria and superstition. James's book Demonology became a significant text in the witch hunts, shaping attitudes towards witchcraft and contributing to the spread of fear. The trials highlighted the destructive power of fear and the lengths to which people would go to find a scapegoat for their misfortunes. As the trials unfolded, Scotland was left to grapple with the consequences of its actions. The North Berwick trials and the role of King James VI in promoting witch hunts became a dark chapter in Scottish history. The lives lost and the suffering inflicted on innocent people served as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked paranoia and the influence of powerful figures on public fear. The story of the North Berwick witch trials is a haunting reflection of a time when fear and superstition could drive a nation to commit unspeakable atrocities. The echoes of these trials reverberate through history, a testament to the human cost of allowing fear to overpower reason and compassion. In the opulent courts of 17th-century France, amidst the grandeur of Louis XIV's reign, a shadowy and scandalous chapter unfolded that would shock the nation and stain the history of its aristocracy. The affair of the poisons, as it came to be known, was a grim spectacle where witchcraft and poisonings intertwined in a drama of deceit, treachery, and murder. It all began with a series of mysterious deaths and illnesses that swept through the French aristocracy. High society, often seen as a glittering beacon of power and prestige, was suddenly shrouded in suspicion and fear. The veneer of elegance masked a world where betrayal and dark arts were at play, revealing a hidden underbelly of corruption and danger. The scandal erupted into the public eye in the early 1670s when it became clear that a network of poisoners had been operating with impunity. The accused were not ordinary criminals, they were well-connected individuals who moved effortlessly through the highest echelons of French society. The web of deceit reached into the very heart of the French court, implicating some of the most influential figures of the time. The key figure in this macabre affair was a woman named Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, better known as La Voisin. She was a renowned fortune-teller and alleged witch who was believed to have provided poisons and charms to the aristocracy. La Voisin's clients were not the impoverished or the desperate, they were the wealthy and powerful, individuals who sought her services to achieve their ends, often through the use of dark magic and poison. The affair grew more complex as investigations revealed that poisonings were not random acts of violence, but part of a larger scheme involving several individuals. The accused included doctors, midwives, and other professionals who had access to the substances used in the crimes. They were charged with producing and distributing poisons that were used to eliminate rivals or to secure inheritances. The scale of the operation was staggering, with accusations reaching the very corridors of power. The methods of these poisoners were as insidious as they were effective. The poisons used were often slow-acting, causing symptoms that mimicked natural illnesses. Victims would suffer in agony before succumbing to their fate, often leaving no clear trace of foul play. This made the poisonings difficult to detect and even harder to prove. The web of deceit and treachery spun by the accused created a cloud of uncertainty and fear, as no one knew who could be trusted. The affair of the poisons also exposed the dark intersection of witchcraft and aristocratic intrigue. The use of poisons was often linked to occult practices, with the accused reportedly using spells and charms in conjunction with their toxic brews. This connection between witchcraft and poisonings added a layer of horror to the scandal, as it suggested that the sophisticated and cultured society of France was deeply entangled with forces beyond comprehension. The investigations into the affair led to a series of trials that uncovered shocking revelations. The court system was inundated with confessions and testimonies that painted a horrifying picture of a society consumed by paranoia and fear. The trials were conducted with a mix of judicial rigor and sensationalism, reflecting the era's fascination with the macabre and the occult. Many of those accused were tortured to extract confessions, leading to a grim cycle of accusations and retribution. The confessions, often made under duress, implicated numerous individuals and extended the scandal's reach far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The trials revealed a disturbing pattern of betrayal, where trust was a luxury that few could afford. The affair of the poisons had a profound impact on French society. The scandal exposed the vulnerability of the aristocracy to internal treachery and external threats, shaking the foundations of the court's stability. The fear of poison and witchcraft became pervasive, casting a shadow over the once glamorous world of French high society. The scandal also led to increased scrutiny and regulation of those involved in the occult and medical practices, as the authorities sought to prevent future occurrences of such dark and dangerous activities. In the end, the affair of the poisons was a chilling reminder of the lengths to which people would go to achieve their desires and the dark undercurrents that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly refined and sophisticated societies. The trials and revelations left a lasting legacy, a haunting echo of a time when fear and superstition combined to create a storm of paranoia and betrayal in the heart of France. In the heart of Italy, the city of Benevento stood as a dark beacon, forever marked by its notorious reputation as the city of witches. Benevento's name would come to be synonymous with the terror of witchcraft trials, where fear and superstition merged into a horrific saga of persecution and suffering. This was a place where whispers of witchcraft and dark magic echoed through its narrow streets, and the shadows of the Inquisition loomed large over its inhabitants. The trials in Benevento began with a chilling blend of rumor and fear. Benevento, nestled in the southern Italian region of Campania, had long been steeped in folklore and superstition. The city's reputation for sorcery was not merely a product of its imagination, it was a grim reality that would become the focal point of a series of brutal trials. The Inquisition, a powerful arm of the Church, was determined to root out and eliminate any traces of what it deemed heresy and witchcraft. Their arrival marked the beginning of a dark chapter in the city's history. The Inquisition, with its relentless pursuit of heretics and witches, set its sights on Benevento. The inquisitors wielded their power with ruthless efficiency, targeting anyone suspected of practicing witchcraft. The trials that ensued were marked by an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Neighbors turned on each other, and long-standing grudges were settled through accusations of witchcraft. In a city where trust was already fragile, the arrival of the Inquisition turned the streets into a battleground of accusations and betrayals. The Church's role in these trials was both chilling and devastating. Under the guise of purging evil, the Inquisition employed methods of torture and intimidation to extract confessions from the accused. The techniques used were as cruel as they were effective. The accused, often innocent of any wrongdoing, were subjected to physical and psychological torment designed to force them into admitting guilt. The Inquisition's goal was not merely to punish, but to instill a pervasive fear that would deter any further dissent or perceived witchcraft. The people of Benevento lived in a constant state of dread. The Inquisition's presence cast a long shadow over the city, as rumors of witchcraft circulated, feeding the flames of paranoia. The trials were not just about punishing those accused, they were about sending a message. The Church wanted to demonstrate its power and control, and the city's residents were left to grapple with the terrifying reality that anyone, from the poorest beggar to the wealthiest merchant, could be accused and condemned. The horrific nature of the trials was made all the more poignant by the stories of those who suffered under the Inquisition's hand. Families were torn apart, with loved ones accused and imprisoned. The emotional toll on the community was profound. People lived in fear of being falsely accused, knowing that once the wheels of the Inquisition's justice were set in motion, there was little hope of escape. In Benevento, the trials were not isolated incidents but part of a broader pattern of witch hunts across Italy. The city's reputation as a center of witchcraft made it a focal point for the Inquisition's efforts, but the terror spread beyond its borders. The methods and madness of the trials in Benevento were mirrored in other parts of Italy, where the Inquisition's reach extended into every corner of society. The witch trials became a symbol of the broader struggle between the Church's authority and the people's fears. The aftermath of the Benevento trials left a scar on the city that would endure for generations. The horrors of the trials became a dark chapter in Italy's history, a reminder of the devastating power of fear and superstition. The legacy of the trials influenced how witchcraft was perceived in the years that followed, serving as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked authority and the consequences of allowing fear to dictate justice. As the trials eventually subsided, Benevento's reputation remained tarnished. The city's dark history became a part of its identity, a reminder of a time when fear and persecution overshadowed its beauty and charm. The echoes of the trials lingered in the collective memory, a poignant reminder of the suffering endured by those accused and the injustice that marked this dark period in history. In the heart of Africa, where ancient traditions intertwine with the rhythms of daily life, the figure of the Sangoma stands as both revered healer and feared sorcerer. These spiritual guides, deeply embedded in the cultural fabric, wield knowledge that bridges the human and spirit worlds. But beneath this veil of respect lies a darker undercurrent, a history of persecution that haunts the very communities they seek to heal. Sangomas are much more than just traditional healers, they are custodians of ancient wisdom, mediators between the physical and spiritual realms. Their practices encompass a broad spectrum of rituals, herbal remedies, and divinations, all aimed at restoring balance and health. They are cherished for their ability to heal physical ailments, ward off malevolent spirits, and offer guidance during life's tribulations. For many, sangomas are the first line of defense against misfortune, deeply respected and integral to community life. Yet, alongside this deep-seated reverence, there exists a chilling reality. The same practices that are celebrated in traditional settings can become the very reason for fear and accusation. The fear of witchcraft and sorcery has led to tragic consequences, as those believed to possess dark powers are persecuted and condemned. The duality of the sangoma's role highlights a profound and painful paradox: the healer who is simultaneously feared as a witch. In various African societies, accusations of witchcraft are often fueled by social, economic, or political strife. When misfortune strikes, a sudden illness, a crop failure, or a personal tragedy, the search for a scapegoat often turns to those who practice traditional magic. The sangomas, whose powers and knowledge are often misunderstood or misrepresented, can find themselves in the crosshairs of these accusations. The fear of malevolent magic becomes a powerful weapon, wielded to settle scores or distract from other issues. The persecution of alleged witches in Africa is not just a series of isolated incidents, but a pervasive and tragic reality. Accusations are frequently driven by fear and superstition, resulting in dire consequences for those accused. People believed to be witches or sorcerers are often subjected to brutal trials, forced confessions, and harsh punishments. The methods of persecution vary from community to community but can include public beatings, imprisonment, or even execution. The toll on individuals and families is profound, leaving a trail of suffering and despair in its wake. In some regions, the fear of witchcraft is so entrenched that it leads to mass hysteria. Entire communities can become swept up in the frenzy of witch hunts, with accusations spreading like wildfire. Those accused may find themselves stripped of their rights, ostracized from their communities, and left to face a hostile world alone. The emotional and psychological scars left by such persecution are deep and lasting, affecting not only those accused, but also the communities that turn against them. Amid this darkness, there are also efforts to address and combat the persecution. Some activists and organizations work tirelessly to protect those accused of witchcraft, advocating for their rights and seeking to educate communities about the true nature of traditional practices. These efforts aim to break the cycle of fear and violence, fostering understanding and compassion in place of suspicion and hatred. The story of the sangomas and the persecution they face is a poignant reminder of the complexities of tradition and the impact of fear. The same individuals who offer healing and guidance can become victims of the very fear they seek to alleviate. Their plight underscores the need for empathy and education, highlighting the urgent need to address the roots of superstition and to promote a deeper understanding of traditional practices. In the rich tapestry of African culture, the sangomas represent both the light and the shadow of spiritual belief. They are symbols of the deep connection between the human and spiritual worlds, yet they are also caught in a tragic cycle of fear and persecution. Their story is a heart-wrenching reflection of the broader struggle between tradition and misunderstanding, a reminder of the pain inflicted by fear and the enduring hope for a future where respect and compassion can overcome ignorance and prejudice. In the Americas, where vibrant cultures collide and blend, witchcraft has taken on unique forms, reflecting a rich tapestry of history and belief. From the shadowed corners of Latin American villages to the rural communities of the southern United States, practices like brujeria and hoodoo weave stories of struggle, resistance, and profound connection to the spiritual world. In Latin America, brujeria, often translated as witchcraft, holds a significant place in the cultural and spiritual landscape. It is a term that encompasses various practices, from healing and protection to magic intended for harm. Brujeria is deeply entwined with the continent's history, shaped by a mix of indigenous traditions and the European influences brought by colonizers. The result is a complex and diverse practice, filled with rituals, symbols, and beliefs that reflect the tumultuous history of the region. For many practitioners, brujeria is not just about casting spells or performing rituals, it is a way of connecting with the ancestors and the natural world. It is a practice grounded in the sacred, where the everyday and the spiritual intertwine. Rituals often involve invoking spirits, working with herbs, and using symbolic objects, all aimed at bringing balance, healing, and protection. Brujeria serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience of indigenous cultures, preserving ancient knowledge amidst the pressures of colonialism and modernization. Yet, the path of brujeria has not always been smooth. Throughout history, practitioners have faced persecution and misunderstanding. The Spanish Inquisition, for example, sought to eradicate what it deemed as heresy, targeting those who practiced brujeria and other forms of folk magic. The result was a dark chapter of fear and violence, where people were punished for their spiritual beliefs and practices. Despite these harsh times, brujeria endured, evolving and adapting to new contexts while maintaining its core spiritual essence. In the southern United States, hoodoo, sometimes called conjure, offers a different but equally profound perspective on witchcraft. Unlike brujeria, which is more commonly associated with Latin America, hoodoo has its roots deeply embedded in African American communities. It emerged from a blend of African spiritual practices, Native American traditions, and European folk magic. This fusion created a unique system of magic and healing that reflects the struggles and resilience of the African diaspora. Hoodoo is known for its practical approach to magic, focusing on everyday concerns such as love, protection, and prosperity. Practitioners often use charms, roots, and herbs, each chosen for its symbolic and magical properties. The practice is deeply personal, often tailored to the specific needs and desires of the individual. It is also a way of maintaining a connection to ancestral wisdom and navigating the challenges of life. Like brujeria, hoodoo has faced its share of challenges. During the times of slavery and segregation, practitioners of hoodoo were often persecuted, their practices viewed with suspicion and hostility. Yet, the spirit of hoodoo survived, carried forward by those who continued to practice in secret or adapted their rituals to fit new circumstances. The persistence of hoodoo reflects the strength and determination of a community that has faced adversity with remarkable resilience. The blending of indigenous beliefs with European influences in both brujeria and hoodoo demonstrates the adaptability of spiritual practices. In Latin America, indigenous traditions mixed with Catholicism and European folklore, creating a rich and diverse tapestry of beliefs and rituals. In the southern United States, African spiritual practices fused with Native American and European elements, resulting in a distinctive form of magic and healing. Both brujeria and hoodoo illustrate how cultural practices evolve and adapt in response to historical and social changes. They are living traditions, continually shaped by the experiences and struggles of those who practice them. The stories of brujeria and hoodoo are not just about magic and witchcraft, they are about survival, adaptation, and the profound connection between the spiritual and the everyday. As we reflect on the history of these practices, we can see the profound impact they have had on the lives of those who practice them. They are not just relics of the past, but vibrant, living traditions that continue to offer guidance, healing, and a sense of connection to the spiritual world. The resilience and adaptability of brujeria and hoodoo are testaments to the enduring strength of cultural and spiritual practices in the face of adversity. In the quiet, ancient corners of Asia, where traditions blend seamlessly with the mystic, witchcraft and shamanistic practices have woven through the fabric of life for centuries. From the secluded villages of China to the mystical forests of Japan and the sacred mountains of Korea, these practices reveal a hauntingly beautiful narrative of spiritual exploration and societal tension. In China, the realm of sorcery and mystical arts stretches back over 2,000 years. Here, witches and sorcerers, sometimes referred to as Taoists or shamans, were believed to wield powerful connections with the spiritual realm. They conducted rituals meant to influence the weather, heal the sick, or curse their enemies. Their practices, deeply rooted in Taoist traditions, were both revered and feared. The Taoist priests, who practiced rituals and divination, were viewed with a mix of awe and suspicion. Their knowledge of the unseen was a source of both wonder and dread. As the influence of the state grew stronger, the perception of these practices shifted dramatically. During the Qing dynasty, Emperor Qin Shi Huang's quest for immortality led him to seek out alchemists and sorcerers, only to have many of them executed when their promises of eternal life failed. This persecution marked a dark chapter in China's history, where the boundary between revered practice and dangerous superstition became dangerously thin. In Japan, the figure of the sorceress is often intertwined with the tradition of Shinto and later, Buddhism. The Yamabushi, mountain ascetics who combined elements of Shinto with Buddhist practices, were known for their shamanistic rituals and mastery of spiritual forces. They performed rites to bring harmony between humans and the spirits of the mountains, forests, and rivers. However, the line between spiritual leader and witch was often blurred. Women known as Miko, or shrine maidens, practiced divination and healing, but their powers were often viewed with suspicion. The most chilling tales come from the period of persecution during the Edo period, when suspected witches and practitioners of dark magic were hunted. The fear of the supernatural, mixed with political control and societal unrest, led to numerous executions. Those accused of using witchcraft were often subjected to brutal methods of interrogation and execution. The fear of supernatural retribution and the desire for control over mystical practices led to a time of intense persecution. Korea's spiritual landscape is also rich with witchcraft and shamanistic practices. Known as mudang in Korea, shamans performed ceremonies to communicate with spirits, heal the sick, and protect their communities from malevolent forces. Their role was crucial in balancing the spiritual world with the everyday lives of the people. Despite their important role, mudangs faced significant challenges and periods of persecution. During the Joseon dynasty, Confucian orthodoxy took hold, and the practice of shamanism was often seen as backward and dangerous. Mudangs were sometimes prosecuted and executed as part of broader efforts to enforce Confucian ideals and suppress what was deemed as superstitious or heretical. The treatment of shamans and witches across these Asian cultures highlights a common thread of conflict between spiritual traditions and evolving societal norms. In all these regions, those who practiced sorcery or shamanism often faced persecution, driven by fear and the desire to control what was seen as dangerous or uncontrollable. This persecution was a manifestation of deeper anxieties about the power of the unseen and the desire to maintain societal order in the face of spiritual uncertainty. In the stillness of these ancient practices, there lies a haunting beauty. These traditions, with their deep roots in the cultural and spiritual lives of their people, tell a story of profound connection to the supernatural world and the often harsh reality of societal fears. The lives of these sorcerers, shamans, and witches were marked by their efforts to bridge the gap between the known and the unknown, a struggle that often led to persecution and pain but also to a deep and enduring legacy of spiritual resilience. The image of a witch has undergone a profound transformation over the centuries, evolving from a figure of fear and persecution to one of empowerment and self-expression. This metamorphosis is not just a historical shift, but a powerful symbol of reclaiming identity and agency. In the dark and fearful times of the witch hunts, witches were vilified and hunted with ruthless determination. They were scapegoats for society's ills, their lives often ending in violence and terror. But as the centuries rolled forward, the image of the witch began to change, shaped by new movements and shifting cultural landscapes. The 20th century marked a significant turning point. In the wake of 2 world wars, as societies grappled with profound changes and a growing sense of disillusionment, a quiet revolution began. It started with individuals and groups reclaiming the word witch and reshaping it into something new. No longer the symbol of fear, witches became symbols of personal empowerment and spiritual freedom. The rise of Wicca in the mid-20th century was a crucial part of this transformation. Founded by figures like Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente, Wicca offered a fresh, positive vision of witchcraft. It embraced nature, celebrated the cycles of the moon and the earth, and promoted a reverence for the divine feminine. The craft, as it is often called, became a path of self-discovery and spiritual connection rather than one of dark magic or malevolence. The practice of Wicca and other modern witchcraft traditions invited individuals to connect with their inner strength and spirituality in ways that were deeply personal and profoundly liberating. It provided a framework for exploring one's own values and beliefs in a way that was empowering rather than oppressive. For many, becoming a witch in the modern sense meant reclaiming a piece of history and culture that had been violently taken away. This resurgence wasn't just about spirituality but also about reclaiming power and identity. For women, in particular, it offered a way to connect with their own strength and resilience. The witch, once a symbol of oppression, became a powerful symbol of female empowerment, autonomy, and resistance. Women and men alike found in witchcraft a way to assert their individuality and challenge traditional power structures. Modern witchcraft has also become intertwined with contemporary social and political movements. It reflects and reinforces ideals of gender equality, environmental stewardship, and personal autonomy. As society has become more open to diverse expressions of identity and belief, the witch has emerged as a symbol of freedom and self-expression. The portrayal of witches in media and pop culture has further solidified this transformation. From the complex characters in literature and film to the vibrant communities on social media, witches are now seen as complex, empowered figures. This modern image is far removed from the frightened outcasts of the past. Instead, it represents a blend of historical depth and contemporary relevance, showing how far the witch has come from the days of persecution and fear. Today, the witch is not just a relic of a bygone era but a living, evolving symbol. The journey from persecution to empowerment reflects a broader narrative of reclaiming and redefining one's place in the world. As modern witchcraft continues to grow and evolve, it serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring quest for personal and spiritual freedom. The haunting tales of history's most notorious witches have left an indelible mark on modern culture, shaping how we perceive these enigmatic figures in literature, film, and popular culture. The legacy of the witch is a potent blend of fear, fascination, and fantasy that continues to captivate our imagination. In centuries past, witches were often victims of intense fear and persecution, their stories shrouded in sorrow and injustice. Yet, from these dark chapters emerged legends that would evolve into powerful symbols in modern times. The stories of women like Salem's accused or the infamous European witches have transcended their historical roots to become central figures in our cultural narrative. These tales have woven their way into our collective consciousness, feeding our fascination with the supernatural and the forbidden. We are drawn to these stories because they evoke a blend of wonder and dread, a reflection of our deepest fears and desires. The witch, as a symbol, embodies the unknown and the mysterious, enticing us with the promise of hidden truths and forbidden knowledge. Literature has long been a canvas for exploring these themes. Classic works like Shakespeare's Macbeth, with its chilling portrayal of the Weird Sisters, showcase how witches can influence and destabilize the natural order. In this play, the witch's prophecies and sinister presence weave the dark magic that drives the plot and fuels the characters' ambitions and fears. These portrayals create a sense of dread and anticipation, keeping readers on edge as they confront the witch's powerful, unsettling influence. As literature evolved, so did the depiction of witches. The 20th century saw a surge in stories that reimagined witches as complex, multifaceted characters. Books like The Crucible by Arthur Miller and The Witching Hour by Anne Rice explore witches not just as symbols of evil but as individuals with rich, intricate inner lives. These narratives reflect a shift from mere villainy to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the witch archetype. Film and television have also played a crucial role in shaping our modern view of witches. From the classic horror of Rosemary's Baby to the whimsical charm of Hocus Pocus and the dark allure of American Horror Story, Coven, witches have been depicted in various ways, reflecting society's evolving attitudes towards them. Each portrayal, whether it's a terrifying sorceress or a quirky heroine, adds layers to the witch's complex legacy. These films and shows captivate audiences by blending elements of horror, fantasy, and comedy, making the witch an ever-present figure in our entertainment. The fascination with witches extends beyond traditional media into popular culture, where they are featured in fashion, art, and even political discourse. The image of the witch has become a powerful symbol of rebellion and empowerment. This modern witch embodies strength and autonomy, reflecting broader cultural shifts towards embracing diversity and challenging societal norms. Witches are no longer just feared or reviled figures, but are celebrated as icons of empowerment and resilience. This enduring fascination is fueled by the witch's ability to symbolize a wide range of human experiences and emotions. They represent a bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary, embodying both the dark and the divine. Their stories resonate with our longing for magic and mystery in a world often defined by the mundane and the predictable. The legacy of the witch is not just a historical curiosity but a living, breathing part of our cultural landscape. It reminds us of our past fears and our enduring fascination with the unknown. As we continue to explore and reinterpret these tales, we keep the witch alive in our imagination, ensuring that her legacy endures in the shadows and the spotlight alike.